Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Are we ready? Oh, I don't know. That wasn't very convincing. Are we ready to have a fantastic evening? Thank you. Thank you. I've had a chance to meet many of you, but if I haven't, I'm Dr. Walter Iwanenko. I'm the president of Gannon University. On behalf of the entire Gannon community, welcome, and we are looking forward to an very, very exciting evening. We're proud once again to partner with the Jefferson Educational Society to host this year's Global Summit. We deeply value and support the Society's mission to bring these globally significant programs to our community right here in Erie. These are programs that broaden our perspectives and deepen our understanding of the world around us, and boy, we need it more now than ever. We're especially proud of our students, our faculty and staff. They're able to take part in these events, and I see a lot of our students and faculty here today. Thank you. This is true experiential learning right here, taking what's talked about in the classroom and having meaningful conversations. So thank you to everybody that makes this happen. At Gannon, we're celebrating our 100th anniversary. What a milestone for the university. But boy, there's a lot of celebrations in Erie this year, right? So we got Gannon Centennial, we got Erie Insurance, our friends up the street at St. Vincent, 150 years. The zoo, I believe, is 100 years. And next year, the 250th anniversary of our country. What a milestone, what a time to celebrate. And it also gives us an opportunity to reflect on our history and those that helped shape it. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ferki Farhadi, president of GES, and he'll be introducing our speaker tonight, also again an alum, Dr. Farhadi.
I still sweat whenever I walk through these halls. Dr. Kozak and Dr. Ostrowski, they didn't suffer fools gladly, and I was one at that point, at least. Thank you, Dr. Ivanenko, for hosting us. Gannon has become our second home at the Jefferson Society, and we're very grateful for our host and everybody here, including Jeff Bloodworth, who's working with our team. It's just, everybody here is wonderful. And Erie has hell of an asset here at Gannon University. I do want to do a quick, because this is our fourth program on Global Summit 17, and I wanted to go through a few of them, let's call them President's Pick, because we do have an additional 15 programs after the night or so. We are back here Wednesday. That is a sold-out event with Jim Kelly. I don't really know much about football, so I'm looking forward to that one. But no, the one that I'm looking forward to is what's going to happen in Europe. And we have the ambassador of the European Union, who just got home about 9-10 months ago now. And what a privilege for Erie to hear what's going on in Europe and what's going to happen to our new defined relationships with Europe. If you like sports, next, let's say, October 27th, we have Woj, Adrian Wojnarowski, and if you like basketball, you should know who he is because he was like Mr. Breaking News for ESPN and left a multi-million-dollar job to go and save his alma mater at St. Bonaventure. So that's going to be a cool story. On November 6th, we have Michael McFall, who has been at the front of our relationship with Russia for 20 years. At one point, he was Putin's number one enemy. I think he might still be. So we aren't afraid, I guess, here at the Jefferson. But he's going to be talking about our relationship with Russia. And what is the future of Russia? Are they going more towards China? And you'll have the new bloc over there? Or as Anne Applebaum would call it, Autocracy Inc. or is it its future into the Europe? So we have somebody there that's going to be talking about that. Please show up to that. And of course, we have Charles Liu. If anybody likes futuristic stuff, I do. He's going to look at what the world will look like in 2050. And that is November 11th. He is one of the best futurists that we have in the country. I've heard his talk a couple of times. It's absolutely, if you think, one of the hypotheses, he says, like, if you go back with our iPhones to 1999, right before it became the year 2000, it would freak people out. He said that would be nothing compared to somebody coming from 2050 to us today. That's only 25 years from now. So the acceleration and the way that humanity is changing is something that we should look at. I'm taking too much time, I know that. There's index cards and pencils for Q&A. Please make sure your writing is readable so that our moderator can get through as many of those as possible. I do want to thank our sponsors, including Gannon and Erie Insurance, and of course our naming sponsor, LECOM, and so many others. And tonight's sponsor is the Hagen History Center and the Historical Society. And here to do the official introduction is my good friend, Cal Pfeiffer. Yeah.
Well, good evening, everyone. Big thank you to President Iwanenko and Gannon University for your hospitality. It's always a treat being next door in Old Main. I was thinking about walking down the sidewalk on West 6th Street this evening. I don't think that there could be a more appropriate venue for presidential history than Gannon University because of Old Main. Deeply connected to at least 2 U.S. presidents. It's almost like Erie trivia. Who built Old Main? We say that it was a wedding gift for the Strongs, but it was not. William Lawrence Scott built it for himself, but he passed. So Grover Cleveland shows up to his funeral. That was the first connection next door. And the second connection, the story we all love to tell, William Howard Taft and the bathtub. And the story goes that he was a large man and he's taking a bubble bath and he gets stuck and they have to take a sledgehammer to get him out of the bubble bath. There's only one problem to the story, as like so many elements of our history. That part is not true. It's not substantiated. William Howard Taft was very much next door. We have the photos to prove it, but he did not get stuck in a bathtub. So you heard it here first tonight. 250 years of the American presidency. That is a lot to cover. I would say whether you look at a local historical perspective, like we interpret regional or national, there are few elements, individuals, or entities that you can point to that have a more profound impact across the perspective of everyday life for Americans than the presidency. We have 2 perfect individuals to interpret the 250 years. Lindsay Chervinsky, who is the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. I will give a shameless plug to Mount Vernon if you have not been. It is a fabulous, fabulous museum. It will remind you of the common ground that we all stand on and what it means to be an American. She's also a author, and Chris Whipple, in addition to being a author and columnist, is a award-winning filmmaker, actually Emmy award-winning. So without further ado, let's give a nice, warm, Erie welcome to Chris and Lindsay.
Lindsay, Chris, welcome. Welcome to Erie. First time here?
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me the occasion.
Absolutely. You've been here before,
Honored
haven't
to
you?
be here. My first time as well.
Welcome. Safe travels. When we were talking about the global summit, before we booked the 44th president, many of you were there for Barack Obama. Wasn't that a great night? Before we booked Vice President Mike Pence, who is going to be here in large part thanks to Lisa Adams of Erie News Now, along with Paul McNulty. So let me add that to the list, Fergie, on November the 5th. That will take place at the Jefferson. We talked about the American presidency, and I said I have two of the most perfect people to talk about that. I have been a great admirer of Lindsay Chervinsky, who is a graduate, by the way, of George Washington University. Now you run the museum and library. And Chris Whipple and I have known each other for many, many years. So thank you both for being with us. Lindsay, I'm going to begin with you. We are about to celebrate America's 250th birthday. And as we were formed as a country, we were fighting the British, but we also had an internal civil war after the Declaration of Independence, as we were aligned by the French and dealing with a lot of internal friction. How did George Washington navigate organizing the military, fighting the British, and dealing with internal strife?
Well, first, thank you so much for bringing me here, and thank you all for being present. I often say that if I were to show up and talk about history and no one was there, I wouldn't have a job. So I'm really glad that all of you are actually interested in learning. You're so right that from the very beginning, the nation was incredibly messy, and there was never unanimity about what the right course of action should be. And that made a lot of sense because many of the colonists, as late as 1770, including George Washington, considered themselves to be the most loyal British subjects. The British Empire was the most democratic system at the time. The Constitution was something they revered. It was the largest navy, the most powerful army, and it was a pretty good economic market to participate in. So you would be a little nuts to want to step away from that, to turn down those opportunities. And of course, they did not know what was going to happen next. So, right now we have this document that's out on display in the library, and it's a song that was written from the British perspective after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And it says, "When the king is victorious, Adams and Hancock will hang from a hill called Beacon." And it's a good reminder of the stakes of what they were actually facing. So there were a lot of people in the colonies who did not want to break from the king, who did not want to break from this amazing constitution and this most democratic system. And in order to actually win, one of Washington's greatest strengths was his understanding that it wasn't enough to win militarily, but that he was fighting for hearts and minds. So he imposed very strict punishment at anyone who was found looting or harassing local communities. He tried really hard not to take food and supplies from farmers nearby. He always insisted on paying them back. Now, sometimes he was paying them in continental dollars, which were worth less than the paper they were printed on, but he was trying. And critically, the Continental Army was also the first effort at national identity formation. Because when the Army was formed in the summer of 1775, there was no United States. The Declaration was still a year in advance. And so he was trying to figure out how to bring people together and create a common identity around an idea that had yet to be fully articulated. And it is therefore no surprise that when this effort was successful, when indeed there was a United States, overwhelmingly, the people that served in office in the first federal government were veterans from the Continental Army who had bought into this idea of what it meant to be an American.
David McCullough had once told me that about a third of Americans or colonialists supported the British government. Another third were adamant to become independent, and another third basically could care less. Is that a fair assessment?
Ish. I'm about to do something that no historian should ever do, which is to correct David McCullough. So there's a quote from John Adams that says 1/3 of Americans were radically in favor, 1/3 were opposed, and 1/3 were ambivalent. That quote was actually from the 1790s when he was talking about the response to the French Revolution. Initially, like the initial French Revolution. And 1/3 of Americans thought that Americans should be super supportive. 1/3 were like, oh, this is looking too violent. And 1/3 were kind of on the fence. However, generally speaking, I do think you can say that probably 40% were ardent patriots. Maybe 30% were ardent loyalists, and that leaves like 30 that were really just trying to survive and get by and get along with whatever army happened to be close to them.
I'm going to come back to George Washington in a moment, but Chris Whipple, as we prepare to celebrate our, I don't even know, what is it called? I'm going to say America's 250.
Semi-sesquicentennial.
Thank you very much.
I have had to practice.
Yeah, you did that very well. What's going through your mind? What should we think about as a nation as we reflect on where we are today? We will talk about Donald Trump, the politics, the division, and of course, we're a very different country today than we were 250 years ago.
Well, first of all, an honor to be here. Great to be here with you, Steve. I'm a big fan of Lindsay's, and let me answer it by saying that one of the reasons I'm a fan of Lindsay Chervinsky
Sounds easy. It's
sorry,
totally get it.
is
How do you say America 250 again?
is that when you read about George Washington, one thing that comes through clearly is that, you know, our history is really the result of decisions made by fallible human beings. George Washington had plenty of luck. And I was saying in an interview a few minutes ago that, you know, so much of what we take for granted as being, you know, safeguards of democracy, the rule of law, it all turns out to be norms that are either followed or not, depending on who's in the office. And we would probably not be a democracy if George Washington hadn't stepped away from the office after 2 terms. Nobody put a gun to his head. He just did it. So fast forward to, of course, January 6, 2021. Obviously, these are fateful decisions, and they're made by flawed human beings. And we're now living through a real test of our democracy. Again, so much of what we thought was sort of bedrock democratic rules turn out to be not so much. You know, we have to constantly defend them and fight for them. So I think we're in a real, we're at an inflection point. We're approaching, there are a lot of anniversaries that we're dealing with, but one of them that's approaching is the first anniversary of Trump 2.0. And it's certainly a test.
I'm going to ask you about Washington's decision, but Chris, let me stay with you because you might have seen the pictures today. I have walked through the East Wing of the White House for decades, and now today, literally torn down to make way for a ballroom.
Yeah, well, it turns out there's no law against doing that. Again, to my point about norms and about flawed human beings, we're living in a period when there are, as it turns out, very few checks on this president's power. We have a Congress that has completely abdicated its responsibilities under Article 1. And, you know, the transformation of the White House is the least of it. Look at the practice of simply blowing up boats in the Caribbean because you suspect that they're drug runners. That's the kind of thing that for which there is, you know, no military authority or moral authority, and Congress is in no mood to check him. So it's no wonder that he will do whatever he wants to do when it comes to the White House as well.
There's no easy way to cover the 46 men and hopefully someday women who served as president. So we're going to go back and forth a lot, and we'll get to your questions. But
George Washington, at the peak of his power, general, military leader, 2 successful terms, had forged the nation, and then walks away. Underscore the significance of that moment, and also as you go through the Washington papers, what more you've learned about him.
Well, I think, it's so important in order to fully assess the impact of these decisions that we don't read history backwards. Because, we are now accustomed to people stepping away from power because that is what we have seen for the most part for the last 250 years. When Washington stepped away from the presidency, that was the age of Napoleon. That was when people were literally fighting to come back into power. And so it just wasn't done, especially not from generals. Generals did not give up power. And the decision reflects Washington's keen awareness that there are 2 fundamental base stones of what it means to be a republic. And if either of them go, then you are no longer a republic. The first is civilian control of the military, and the second is peaceful transfer of power. If either of them are changed, then you have some other kind of system. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have a bad system. It's just not a republic. And Washington had a very clear understanding of that. And so one of the things that's been such a joy as I've been spending more time in his archives is looking at all of the steps that went into that decision. So especially during the war, there were a lot of mutinies that he put down. There were a lot of attempts to control congressional power through armed force. The most famous is the Newburgh Conspiracy, which was in the spring of 1783. It was clear that the war was coming to an end. His officers hadn't been paid in years, and they were thinking about ways that they could force Congress to pay them the back pay they were owed, including force. Washington got wind of this. He called a meeting. He very famously brings an address to read to them. He starts to stumble. He pulls out his spectacles, which you did not wear in polite company at the time. And he said, "Forgive me, I have gone blind and gray in service to my nation." And the entire room apparently burst into tears. Now, what they don't tell you is that he also had his very large Major General of the Artillery blocking the door just in case that didn't work. So he had a little bit of a carrot stick approach going here. But he then, and this is a letter we recently acquired, 2 weeks later wrote an 11-page, in his hand, an 11-page letter to Congress saying, you must figure out how to pay them. If we are going to decommission the Army safely and preserve civilian control of the military, you must figure out how to pay them. And so it wasn't just the 2 decisions to step down, which were monumental and unseen at that point in the world, but it was all of the decisions leading up to that to make that possible.
So, Chris, under the category of knowing when to step down, President Joe Biden, you write, had the president's advisors engaged in wishful thinking about Biden's ability to overcome the effects of aging, or did they cover up his condition in order to stay in power? You write about this extensively in your most recent book. Take us in the room, ultimately what led to his decision in July of last year to step down and what impact that had on the election that we just witnessed.
Well, it seems to me that the mystery at the heart of my book about the 2024 campaign, and of course at the heart of that decision on that momentous weekend of July 2021, 2024, is the extent to which Joe Biden's inner circle, the advisors around him, were caught up in a kind of fog of delusion and denial. You may have read that other guy's book, Jake Tapper, who argued that Joe Biden was a non-compos mentis and completely incapable of governing during this whole period. Respectfully, I have a very different view. The truth is that Joe Biden was no Woodrow Wilson. You may recall that Wilson was incapacitated by a stroke to the extent that his wife Edith was making decisions for him toward the end of his presidency. Not so with Biden. He was making decisions behind closed doors. He was governing, for better or worse, depending on your point of view. But he was no Woodrow Wilson. What he couldn't do was campaign, and everybody knew it. And it is, in my view, a tragedy, a scandal, really, that Biden and his advisors thought he could run for re-election at the age of 82. He'd be serving at the age of 86. He was clearly slowing down. But ultimately, I really disagree with Tapper about this. The truth is that Biden was governing capably behind closed doors. And in fact, I spoke to, this was right after I finished the book, somebody reached out to me who was an insider in the Biden White House with no dog in this fight, who was in the Situation Room, was on Air Force One 150 times or more with Biden, on Air Force One, on phone calls with foreign leaders, who said he was okay, he was fine. The truth is that he just could not, he was incapable of campaigning. And as I say, I think it's a scandal that his 11th hour abdication left Kamala Harris with too short a runway to mount a successful campaign against Donald Trump.
So let me follow up on two fronts. First of all, the debate preparations, which by all accounts were a disaster. Ron Klain, who served as his chief of staff, was a close confidant of Joe Biden. Why did they go through with that debate? And had that debate not happened, would things have been different?
Well, Ron Klain is in the doghouse with Joe Biden and his closest advisors because he spoke to me. He told me that whole story for my book. And to this day, he's now persona non grata with Biden. It is true that Biden was just not, as Klain explained it to me during the week at Camp David preparing for the debate, he was obsessed with foreign leaders. He was talking about how Macron and others were praising him as a world leader. He was completely uninformed about the campaign. He was not up to speed. He wandered out to the swimming pool at one point during a session and fell asleep. So there's no doubt that he was he was not on top of his game by any means. But here's the thing about the notion that this was a conspiracy by Biden's inner circle. It was the Biden campaign's idea to have that early debate in June of 2024. They could easily have kept him under wraps until the fall, when you traditionally debate your opponent. They wanted him out there. Why? In my view, it was because they were expecting the Joe Biden who showed up at the State of the Union speech in 2024. And some of you may remember that he was heckled by the MAGA GOP crowd, and he owned them in the moment. And not just on a teleprompter. I mean, he was on his toes. They were betting that guy would show up at the debate. A very different Joe Biden arrived.
One final question. Jill Biden. She obviously saw what was happening, and yet, by all accounts, kept him in the race.
Yeah. My view about that is that I think with the First Lady or spouse of the president, my tendency is to cut them some slack. I mean, I think that Jill Biden was completely supportive of Joe. You can argue that she really should have, told him hard truths and said, "You're not up to this." But I would say that responsibility falls more squarely on the guys who were paid to advise him, and the professionals who are around him. I'm talking now about Steve Ricchetti, Mike Donilon, and others who were in his inner circle. Those guys get paid the big bucks to tell the president what he doesn't want to hear. And I think with a spouse, I think it's just much more complicated.
Lindsay, as you look at the American presidency, and certainly Washington, Lincoln, Jackson, Roosevelt. Both Roosevelts defined and redefined the presidency. So if you look at the arc of the last 250 years, what stands out in terms of the men who served and the influence they've had on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
It's a big question. Well, I think that the presidents we remember the most, so we were doing an interview ahead of time, and I was saying that I think that many of the key elements of what makes the presidency are consistent all the way back to Washington. So we expect the president to be the leading voice in foreign policy. We expect the president to take an active leadership role when it comes to domestic crises. We expect the president to sort of be the voice for the American people. All of those go back to Washington, and those were intentional decisions Washington made to carve out that authority and that jurisdiction for the executive. So that in some ways remains constant, and you see it in particular in what we consider to be strong presidents, those that really know how to use that authority, like the ones you mentioned, Jackson, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR. What I think makes those moments particularly unique is I liken American politics to kind of, I'm from California, so I use the tectonic plates leading up to an earthquake parallel, where you have a lot of small shifting and tension building over a long period of time, and then you have a dramatic sort of shift, and they kind of pop against each other, and that's what produces either your earthquake or your volcano. American society is that way too. We have these sort of gradual changes that take place over several decades, and then you have an explosion of cultural, technological, political change that often produces different party formations and is captured by a charismatic leader. So you can't just have one or the other. You can't just have a party change. You can't just have a technological change. You can't just have a leader who really knows how to use the tools that he and someday she is given. But you have to have all of those. And so the presidents we really remember are those that know how to capture the moment and speak to the American people in that moment of explosive change.
Can I just add to that, Steve, that, there was during FDR's era, there was a so-called Brownlow Commission or committee that studied the presidency, and their conclusion was presidents need help. The people surrounding the president have an awful lot to do with his success or failure. You think of, I was fascinated just reading Lindsay's work to discover that it really, there was no rule book that suggested that a president needed a cabinet. It was really Washington's idea based on his war council, right? And it was a year and a half in, or 2.5 years
well,
in.
so the delegates at the Constitutional Convention actually explicitly rejected a cabinet. So it's not in the Constitution. And he didn't have his first cabinet meeting until 2.5 years
Yeah.
into the office.
So now fast forward to Dwight Eisenhower, who decided one day, another general, that he needed a White House chief of staff. And he empowered this rough, tough guy named Sherman Adams. He became known as the abominable no man. He was truly the president's gatekeeper. And from that moment forward, we haven't really had cabinet government. We've had the West Wing is where the power resides. It resides often in an empowered White House chief of staff. And I wrote a book, the subtitle of which was How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. And to some extent, I believe it. I think there would have been no Reagan Revolution without James A. Baker III. There might have been no second term for Bill Clinton, if not for Leon Panetta, who came in a year and a half into Clinton's presidency, whipped the White House into shape, and turned that presidency around.
Well, let's talk about this president, because in his first 4 years, Donald Trump went through, 5 chiefs of staff? He is now four, 2 in the first year. He still has his first chief of staff, Susie Wiles. So what does that tell you about her, Susie Wiles, somebody who you know?
Well, you're right that Trump blazed through 4 chiefs of staff, one more hapless than his predecessor. I mean, It was mission impossible. None of them were empowered. Trump didn't seem to understand what the job was about. And now, fast forward to Trump 2.0, everything has changed. And Susie Wiles is the difference, in my view, between Trump 1.0 and 2.0. I exaggerate slightly. Obviously, there are a lot of other factors.
But what is she doing that others did not do?
She is a fascinating character, for one thing. I mean, going all the way back to, she came up through Florida politics. She worked for Ronald Reagan as a 23-year-old scheduler.
Pat Summerall's daughter.
She was Pat Summerall's daughter. Pat Summerall, the famous broadcaster, was not only the so-called voice of the NFL, but he was an alcoholic and an absentee father. And Susie would be the first to tell you that that's how she learned to deal with difficult men. It has stood her in good stead with the likes of not only Trump, but Ron DeSantis, whom she helped to elect in 2018. And in a kind of hinge of history, DeSantis turned on her afterwards, tried to destroy her career for reasons that are still not clear, by the way. And the rest is history, because she went back to work for Donald Trump. I think she ran a brilliant campaign. And long-winded answer, Steve, I'm sorry, but in the White House, I think that there's been plenty of chaos, and that's vintage Trump. But she has succeeded in running that White House without drama, without backstabbing and internecine warfare that characterized the first 4 years. And it's largely because Trump trusts her. Everybody knows she speaks for him. And she just has she has a gift for managing people.
Lindsay, as you know, we hosted former President Barack Obama. He is now relatively young, 64 years old, so he's got a long post-presidency ahead of him. His library is going to open next year. Jimmy Carter left the White House in his mid-50s and totally redefined the job of a former president. Probably go back to John Quincy Adams, who was the other person to redefine the post-presidency. Joe Biden will not have that luxury at his age. We wish him good health and all the best. But just talk for a moment about the post-presidency period and what you've seen over the course of history.
Well, I love that comparison. In fact, after Carter died, I wrote a piece saying exactly that. They're the only two presidents to rewrite their legacy after leaving office. A lot of others have tried, including Richard Nixon, but they're the only two that I think have written the first line of their obituary after their presidency. So post-presidencies as a thing were generally pretty rare because modern medicine didn't exist. So, you have the lovely exception of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson exchanging these amazing letters and then dying on the same day on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence. You can't make this stuff up. If you did, a TV producer would tell you you're being too cliche. But for the most part, presidents lived a couple of years. They usually did so in relative obscurity, and then they died because people died much younger, and you couldn't really predict what your life was going to be like. Even those that were on the younger side, like Theodore Roosevelt, people around him said that his heart just gave out because he lived so much life in the relatively short period of time. He lived 3 lives in the time that most people do 1. So I would say the concept of a modern post-presidency is really a relatively recent one. And I think it is complicated by things like presidential libraries, which FDR was the first to officially have one, and then we ended up backdating to Hoover. Certainly things like presidential papers and the concept of a foundation and the concept of philanthropy and involvement in some way in global affairs. These are all opportunities for a president to redefine their legacy. But it is also complicated because presidential legacies are, of course, shaped by what they did in office, but also what comes after. And a lot of that is out of their control. So how did their legislation live on? How did their successors respond to their to their movement, to their policies, and who comes after them. So when George W. Bush left office, his approval rating was lower than almost any other president. It has since bounced pretty high because of the comparison by those that followed him. So I think that presidential legacies, as much as they would like to be something that they have control over, very rarely do they have the ability to define.
And Chris, the legacy includes who succeeds you in the White House. One of the things I've often wondered about is Lyndon Johnson, who probably had one of the most significant 4 years of any president with the Great Society program. Of course, he had to deal with the Vietnam War, the strife in America, but did very little to ensure that his successor would be Hubert Humphrey. Instead, it was Richard Nixon who would dismantle or try to dismantle much of his legacy. And I guess the answer was LBJ's ego. Your thoughts?
Well, that was certainly a big part of it. And I'm writing a book now. The book I started when and put aside when Joe Biden suddenly dropped out of the race, and I decided to pivot to a book on the campaign. But I'm doing a book now about presidential campaigns from 1968 to the present, and that 68 campaign was just absolutely wild. I mean, almost as wild as 2024, and with a lot of similarities, assassinations taking place, and a president suddenly abdicating. There's no question that LBJ, there are those who think that at the end of the day, LBJ was so furious with Hubert Humphrey that he preferred Richard Nixon to Humphrey in that race. He certainly didn't do much to help Humphrey as vice president. Humphrey, at the very last minute, I mean, basically October 30th, just before the election, finally broke with LBJ over the conduct of the Vietnam War. A lot of people thought he should have done so sooner, and he ended up he had a real surge and barely lost in a photo finish against Richard Nixon. I think that Kamala Harris maybe could have taken a page from Hubert Humphrey in that 2024 race, and that she had an opportunity on The View to break with Joe Biden and say that she might do something differently, and she famously whiffed on that question. I digress, but I think that there's no question that that Humphrey and LBJ had a very fraught relationship, and that hurt him in the 68 campaign.
But if you read Kamala Harris's book, she was loyal to Joe Biden. She wanted to show that loyalty. And the night of the debate, Joe Biden calls Kamala Harris to make sure that she was going to remain loyal. Biden is out of the picture. He's still president, but his legacy is on the line.
Well, I would, if Kamala Harris were here with us, I would love to ask her if it is also true, as I was told, and contrary to some other reporting that's out there, I reported in my book that Joe Biden called her and said to her, look, I get it. Do what you have to do. That far from telling her that she had to toe the line and defend all of his policies, that he got it. He understood. So she may well have had he may well have had that other conversation as well. But I'm told not only that, but that when Kamala's campaign manager went to visit Jeff Zients, the Joe Biden's White House chief, that Zients also gave her the green light and said, "Look, we get it."
And yet she didn't.
And yet she didn't. And she says she was loyal. She was being loyal to Joe Biden, and that's admirable up to a point. But I also think, and I know certainly a lot of other people I've talked to, Leon Panetta and others felt that she missed an opportunity to distance herself from Biden in a way that might have helped her. Look, she had an almost impossible challenge. She had to be the change candidate in a change election as the sitting vice president. So Could she have created any distance that might have helped her? Could she have said, when asked on The View, what would you have done differently? Could she have said, look, I'm proud of A, B, C, and D that we did together, but you know what? We blew it on the border, and we should have done more about inflation, and here's what I'm going to do.
I'd jump in there.
Please do.
I think this gets at one of the fundamental weirdnesses of the vice presidency. Are there any baseball fans in the audience? Okay, so
Dodger fans?
baseball fans know that one of the worst things in the human body is the hamate bone. It's a little bone in your hand. It does absolutely nothing. It's a vestige of, bear with me, this actually does have relevance. It is the vestige of evolution. And if you get hit in the hand as a player when you're batting, it breaks really easily, and then you're out for weeks and weeks because it has to be removed by surgery. And so many managers just feel like you should remove it when you're a child and then never have to deal with it ever again. The vice president is kind of that of the Constitution. It is the hamate bone of the Constitution, in that it was put in a weird way. They have two responsibilities. They have to cast tie-breaking votes, which Kamala Harris did to a higher number than any other president. She broke John Adams' record. And they have to have a pulse. That does not set you up to have a particularly good relationship with the president. You have to be loyal in order to be a success, because if you're backstabbing a president, then that looks bad and doesn't make you seem like a good vice president. But if you're too loyal, then it's really hard to actually run for office as your own person. This is a dynamic that has happened again and again and again and again. And so even under the best of circumstances, there's a reason vice presidents almost never win. And this was certainly not the best circumstance.
Martin Van Buren and George H.W. Bush, the only two to succeed.
I get it.
Right.
That says all you need to know.
So, can I impose on you for a moment? Would you come up? You, yes. I met this woman tonight, although she knew my sister. Of course, everyone knew
You've
somebody.
been
in my
dumped
family.
for good reason.
Just, this will all make sense. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Carol Renz Blake, and I grew up in Erie, PA, but I worked in Washington, D.C., and I worked for H.R. Bob Haldeman. And I had the good luck of talking to this wonderful author tonight. And I did tell him he should have met me a long time ago, because I probably could have given him some other
That is for
points.
sure.
So this is your life, but you worked for Bob Haldeman when?
I worked for Bob Haldeman from 1971 to 1973.
And what were you doing on June 17th, 1972?
Sure. You already know the answer to this. I was sitting with my then boyfriend, who had come to D.C. from Philadelphia. He was going to medical school, watching the news. And I looked at him and I said, I don't want to go to work on Monday.
Thank you.
Not at the Watergate.
I hope I didn't embarrass you. Thank you. Watch your step. So why did I bring that up? Thank you, by the way. I just met her tonight. It's a great story. Lindsay, I don't want to oversimplify the complications of Watergate. It was a political scandal. The press did its part.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Nixon ultimately did what was right under the Constitution. He resigned the presidency. It was a scar on our democracy, but we went through it. And there were checks and balances, including Congress doing its job. Can you talk about that in light of what we're seeing today?
Yeah, so there are a couple elements that I really want to pull on that. So there's this concept of you probably have heard the press referred to as the Fourth Estate. And this concept goes back to 18th century Britain, when ancient regimes and old societies were organized into three estates. There was the nobility, there was the clergy was the first estate, the nobility, and then sort of the common man. And in Britain, with the parliamentary reform that made Parliament more powerful vis-a-vis the king, you started to see the rise of a vigorous political press and an opposition party. So you had the Whigs and the Tories. And this developed a custom which was referred to as a loyal opposition. And that meant that you could disagree with the people in power and not be traitors. You could disagree with the king or with Parliament or the Privy Council, and you were still a loyal Briton. And the press, as it became more concrete, began to be referred to as the fourth estate. And it was a very important part of this process to hold people to account, to hold power to accountability. Americans included that in their tradition from the very beginning, which is why the First Amendment includes the right to petition, free speech, of course, protection from government restrictions on freedom of the press, as the Fourth Estate was an essential part of our government. So what's so important about Watergate, as you said, was, of course, the Fourth Estate had a crucial role in displaying this scandal, revealing the facts, revealing the participants. The key figures, however, in my estimation, were actually the Republicans in Congress, because the Republicans in Congress were the ones that went to Richard Nixon and said, you have to resign because we will vote for basically your impeachment. Now, what's really important to note is that by 1980, they won a landslide victory with Ronald Reagan. So they were basically out in the wilderness for less than 7 years, which is a good reminder that doing the right thing and maybe losing power temporarily is not a death sentence. So in that moment, what I see is all of the different people that have power in a political system exercising it to the fullest extent. And that is where, as Chris said earlier, Congress is absent. Congress has completely given up its, and this is not just in this administration, this is true over the last couple of decades, completely given up its oversight over the executive branch, over the Supreme Court. Until fairly recently, Congress established Supreme Court jurisdiction, and they have stopped doing that. So in order for our system to actually work, it depends on each branch of government being jealous of its own power in order to hold the other to account. And that's what I think we're missing.
So the obvious question for you, Chris Whipple, is why. One of those, by the way, was a Pennsylvania Senator, Hugh Scott, who went to Richard Nixon along with Barry Goldwater and Howard Baker and said, you got to leave. It is very different, obviously, 50 years later. The media landscape is different. That is a huge factor in all of this, social media. But we're all going into our different silos. And you're scum or you're the enemy if you disagree with certain individuals. So why now? Why not the way it's supposed to be with three separate but equal branches?
Well, because those branches have really abdicated their responsibility, beginning with Congress. And I would argue that the Supreme Court as well, with that really insane decision suggesting that the president is immune from any kind of criminality when he's in office. I'm old enough to remember that when Nixon tried to withhold the Watergate tapes, we were talking earlier about the great Alexander Butterfield, who was a true patriot who revealed the existence of that taping system in the White House. Well, anyway, when that tape surfaced, and Nixon tried to withhold it, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously 8-0 with Justice Rehnquist recusing himself that no, when there's a possibility of criminal activity taking place in the Oval Office, no, that the executive privilege yields to the public's right to know. And the result was that famous visit by Hugh Scott and Barry Goldwater to Nixon. Now remember that the so-called smoking gun tape was captured Nixon talking with his aides, saying that let's have the CIA tell the FBI that you cannot dig into this. It will expose state secrets in effect. That smoking gun tape was enough to send the Republican leadership straight to the Oval Office and tell Nixon that it was time to go.
But today they would say that's AI generated. It's fake news. It didn't happen.
Well, my point is that when you look at the politicization of the Justice Department by Donald Trump, Nixon's crimes pale in comparison. I mean, it's just a fact. And so we have, again, I can't explain why we've reached this point, but certainly the failure of Congress, the failure of the other branches of government to exercise their powers, to act as a check on the abuse of power is part of it, and certainly the media landscape for sure.
And jump in real quick on that. So the immunity decision, typically when people say the founders thought that, whatever they're about to say afterwards, it's a red flag that that's hogwash because the founders agreed on so little, with a couple of exceptions. One, there were to be no kings. And that is particularly important in regards to the immunity decision because the whole point of the revolution is that kings cannot be held accountable. The point of the revolution is to have a system in which the people who are leading you can be held accountable for their actions. And they believed strongly in the importance of accountability for all of their leaders, including presidents. And George Washington was the first to assert executive privilege. He didn't call it that at the time. That was a term that was coined by Eisenhower. But in his assertion of executive privilege the first time, he said, he reminded Congress that he had complied with frequent requests for materials, that he respected their right to oversight, that he was asserting executive privilege in this one moment because of a national security issue. But if it was an impeachment proceeding, that would be a higher level of oversight, and he would not be able to basically cross that bar, and he would turn over the papers. So he was kind of daring them to impeach him, which obviously was not going to happen, and he knew it. But he also was establishing that there is a level of oversight that is so much more important than anything else that, of course, he would have to comply. And so if people truly are originalists, if they truly care about the original intent of what the Constitution said and the first people who used it, presidential accountability would be the very heart and center of everything they did.
Chris, in one of the interviews I did with President Gerald Ford, and we talked about Nixon and we talked about the partisanship in Congress, but he made the point, and this has been made by others as well, is, look, we've been in the bunker. I've been at sea. We've been at war in World War II. That really defined our generation. So despite our sharp political differences, and there were many, there was something that united them all because they had lived through, if you go through FDR all the way through George H.W. Bush, they all served in World War II in one way or the other. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, no, I think that certainly had a lot to do with, again, we're talking about fallible human beings, and we count on them to make decisions based on the Constitution and the best interests of the country over self, over their own power. Jerry Ford was a classic example of that. I mean, just the most decent human being. And I would say, whoever served as president, he was an extraordinarily decent human being.
He never wanted it.
Yeah, no, he didn't want it. And he, but he stepped into it. And performed with real honor and decency, and of course, his pardon of Richard Nixon was extraordinarily controversial and probably cost him the election against Jimmy Carter. And yet, a lot of people, in retrospect, I get it, think that was probably something that he should have done. He felt that it would have been impossible for him to govern with that cloud, with that continuing animus toward Nixon and the court proceedings, and but it was a pretty bold and selfless decision, I think.
And yet, at his inauguration, Jimmy Carter, his first words praising Gerald Ford for uniting the country. So a different time, a different era. We're going to get to your questions in just a moment, but we'll do a little bit of lightning round. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, what was their relationship like?
Family members, frenemies, enemies, friends.
Frenemies because?
There were periods of time, I would say early in Washington's presidency, where they clearly disagreed on things but they wanted to get along because they had been so close. And that was true up through the early days of Adams' presidency. And then Jefferson comes remarkably close to treason as vice president.
For obvious reasons, Chris Whipple, what made Lincoln such an incredible leader?
Well, now you've my area of expertise is really the 20th century, but
Lincoln's an easy
I'll
one.
take a stab at the obvious answer. I mean, he preserved the Union. I get it. It's that simple.
What about you? As a leader, we know he's a great president, but he had the fortitude and the insight and the ability and the humanity and the decency and the compassion and just his overall persona that we're still talking. More books written about Lincoln than just about anyone else.
Yeah, I think the only one that has more is Jesus, if I am correct.
You are correct.
I get it.
He was
I get it.
remarkably persistent and stubborn when all evidence suggested that he should give up, and he did not, and yet was able to do so with incredible compassion. And that combination is pretty rare.
Okay, this is an easy one for you. Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump's fascination with Jackson.
Well, I think it's I get it. I think it's populism has been a real just a constant thread throughout American history, and I think that Trump sees his relationship with his MAGA followers the same way that Jackson saw his relationship with his followers.
His first stop was Hermitage, Tennessee in his first term, his first trip outside of D.C.
Yeah. So I think there's no question about it. He there's a bond there that between them, and I think that again, this is something that we've seen throughout American history and particularly certainly in the 20th century with George Wallace and Trump as well. I mean, I think that, and if you want to really look at recent history, I think you can make a pretty good argument that we have, with the exception of George H.W. Bush in 1988, we've been electing outsiders almost every time when you think about it. And that's something that both, I think, Trump and Jackson, they were the ultimate examples.
You can take this any way you want, but as you look at the 20th century presidents, who stands out in terms of shaping the nation, shaping the world, and shaping the office?
I get it.
Let's see. Well, FDR is the obvious choice, both in terms of shaping the nation and shaping the office, because he expanded it so dramatically. I'm going to pick two for shaping the world, and they're back to back, but for different reasons. So Ronald Reagan really embraced the, city on a shining hill. What is it? Shining city on a hill. There it is. And presented that image in a way that it had floundered because of Vietnam and Korea and had been complicated, and embracing that idea was a powerful one. But the person who actually made that a reality was H.W. Bush, because he showed a characteristic that we so rarely celebrate in presidents, and gosh, do we really need to, which is restraint. When the wall fell in Berlin, he could have gloated. He could have, if there had been Twitter at the time, he could have written a ton of messages about how he was the greatest of all time because he ended the Cold War and no one's ever done something like that before. And he didn't. He was silent, and he did everything in his power to prevent nuclear explosion and incredible violence. And that shaped the world.
Well, no, wait. President Trump just said he ended a war. No other president has done that before.
I think you said 8. I think we're up to 8, right?
You're laughing, Chris.
Well, and also George H.W., speaking of restraint, he did not push on to Baghdad either in the Gulf War.
So before we get to your questions, thank you. You have both written some amazing books, and Christmas is just a few months away. So talk about your book and your book, because they're for sale and they'll be signing afterwards. So we'll begin with you.
Thank you. Well, my first was on George Washington. It was called The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. It explores how Washington created the cabinet, given that it's not in the Constitution, and why he did so, and critically, how that established a precedent for every president that followed. The next one, which is, I believe, the one that's for sale here, is called Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. And it looks at if Washington established all these precedents and norms, what happens when a mere mortal is in office? And how do they actually become precedents with the repetition over time, most notably being the first two peaceful transfers of power at the two bookends of John Adams' presidencies, and what it takes to actually teach the American people how to cherish that part of our tradition.
And Chris, you take us once again into all of last year.
Well, run on by Lindsay's books for sure. They're terrific. I mean, so my first book, called The Gatekeepers, was about the White House chiefs of staff, starting with H.R. Haldeman and going up all the way up through Trump 1.0. And so I have a soft spot about the first book. The book that I'm signing here, in a way, though, might be the most important thing I've done, because again, I was writing a different book in June of 2024, and suddenly Joe Biden was out, actually July. When Biden dropped out, I called my publisher and I said, this is the political scandal of the century, and I think I'm in a unique position to write it, not because I'm smarter than anybody else, but because I happen to have sources at the very top of Joe Biden's campaign and Donald Trump's campaign, and I like my chances with Kamala. And so I really felt compelled to write it. Like Kamala, I had 107 days to do it, and I did my best, and I'd be happy to sign it for you.
What he's not telling you is there's a third, so you really should do the trilogy. And maybe this is an unpopular position, but my favorite of his is called The Spy Masters, and it's about the heads of the spy agency, and it's fantastic.
And your next book on campaign managers, which will come out when?
Working on it now. The working title is The Kingmakers, and it's the presidential campaign managers from 68 to the present. Haldeman again. Haldeman and Mitchell and
We got to get together.
Bill
for
Casey. We're going to have to talk some more. It's a rogues gallery, as you can imagine, including people like Lee Atwater and James Carville and Karl Rove and all the way up to Susie Wiles.
So questions from the audience. Thank you very much. What about Teddy Roosevelt? What did he bring to the presidency?
I get it.
I'll confess, there's a book coming out next month on Teddy Roosevelt called In the Arena, and
I get it.
Because I really wanted to use that title when I eventually wrote about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt so first of all, he was of a younger generation. He was so vibrant. He was so energetic. He could not be restrained. He had an unbelievable knack for using the technology that was available to him, which was primarily, of course, the rise of photography and the rise of a journalist class that was interested in breaking news and telling the truth and holding power to account. And so he brought them into the White House. He had briefings with them daily, and he understood how to speak to the American people and harness the energies that were building up at a grassroots level, particularly with the progressive movement. So environmental protection and conservation, food safety reform, child labor laws, reform or restrictions on the major robber barons, especially of the railroad and coal industries. He understood how to harness those energies and actually get things done. Gosh, he's just so darn interesting. So maybe if I wait long enough, I can use that title again, which is a quote from my favorite speech of his, which is, it's called the In the Arena speech. It's
Richard Nixon's favorite speech too, wasn't it?
It's an interesting company to have. But it says it's not the person who wins everything, but it's the man in the arena trying that really counts.
Chris, why did Reagan succeed as president, as the great communicator?
Well, he was, to begin with, just born a great communicator, for sure. He was he was obviously trained as an actor. He would always hit his marks. He was also a good speechwriter, a better speechwriter than most people give him credit for. But again, I would argue that there would have been no Reagan Revolution without his White House Chief of Staff, James A. Baker III. Just to give you a quick example, when Reagan took office, he was hell-bent on tackling Social Security and reforming Social Security. Baker knew that was the third rail of American politics. You touch it, you get electrocuted. He was smart enough to round up allies in the form of Nancy Reagan and a few others. And he sat Reagan down and he explained this to him. Reagan didn't want to hear it, but he eventually took his advice. And with the result, they pivoted to the economy, and the rest is history. And he managed to reform Social Security in his second term with the Greenspan Commission and had political cover to do so. That was an example of how Jim Baker knew how to turn Ronald Reagan around on a dime.
Which was bipartisan. By the way, there's a Reagan connection to Erie because he came here on at least 2 occasions for General Electric. And of course, he came when he was running for president as well. One quick sidebar story. Don Regan is the White House Chief of Staff, hangs up on Nancy Reagan.
Yeah, not a good idea when you're White House Chief of Staff. Don Regan was terribly miscast. This was the most disastrous job swap in American history, in my view, because Don Regan came to Jim Baker, who was wiped out, exhausted, desperate to get out of the job after 4 years. And Regan said, why don't we just swap jobs? He was Treasury Secretary. Well, it was a disaster. The next thing we knew, Iran-Contra had bubbled up from the basement of the White House, from the NSC, and Reagan did nothing to stop it. Reagan was arrogant. He thought he was the prime minister. His nickname was the prime minister. He treated Reagan like the retired chairman of the board. And as Steve mentioned, his days were numbered when Nancy Reagan called him up and he got exasperated and hung up on her. He was gone the following week.
Lindsay, this is for you. I believe that George Washington stepping down, one of the most American things to be done. What do you feel about term limits for members of Congress?
I have more mixed feelings about term limits for members of Congress than I do for the Supreme Court. So I'm going to take the question that I want to answer and not the one that was asked.
Like a true politician. But you're our guest here, so you can do whatever you want.
I think with Congress, it's really tricky because, especially for a long time, you had women coming into office later in life, often after they had children. So when you get to the point where you certainly don't want age limits for that reason. Term limits are hard because it does prevent actually the buildup of expertise, and there's some evidence to suggest that it increases the impact of lobbyists on Congress because they're the ones that actually have expertise. But term limits are essential, I think, for the Supreme Court. The proposal that I really like is 18 years. It would basically allow for every 2 years, a new Supreme Court justice would roll off onto an emeritus board, and the president would appoint a new justice. It would take the gamification out of the nominations. The nominations are, of course, intensely political. We're not going to take politics out of them, but let's make it more regular and clear about how that process works so everyone understands how that process works. And then the emeritus board could adjudicate on like questions of ethics. If a justice does need to recuse himself or herself, or if there is a tie because someone has recused, then you have an additional set of justices that can step in. So I think that is essential. No one expected justices to serve this long. That was certainly not the practice or expectation of the first hundreds of years of American history. And I think it's actually done a disservice because now the goal is to pick the youngest person that you can possibly get onto the court, as opposed to the person that you think is actually the best jurist.
Well, let's talk about the norms. So let me ask you about the death of Antonin Scalia, February 2016. Barack Obama has almost a year left in his presidency. Mitch McConnell holds the nomination for a full year. And then, of course, Trump is elected. Fast forward, because he said, let the voters decide, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies a few months before the 2020 election.
When votes were already being cast.
And they moved very quickly to get a Supreme Court nominee while Trump is still president. Forget about the politics of that. I understand the politics. I'm wondering about how that affected the institution of the Supreme Court and how people view the court today, this generation.
Well,
I get
think
it.
There are two things there. So in the 19th century, everyone understood that the court was intensely political. Supreme Court justices would run for office. They would help in presidential campaigns. They were intensely involved in politics. And because that was everyone's expectation, it didn't harm the credibility or the trust that people had in the institution, because that was just what it was. Today, so it's not necessarily that the politicization of the court is a problem. It's that the recent, or what appears to be a recent politicization of the court, has undermined public trust. And as many people have pointed out over the course of history, the Supreme Court does not have an army with which to enforce its decisions. Its power is based on people listening to what it says and believing what it says and being willing to go along with what it dictates. And so the chicanery around those nominations, whether or not you support them or not, for a lot of people, it undermined the credibility of the institution, and it was one of many things that we have seen has led to a precipitous decline in trust. And that lack of trust, which frankly right now applies to all public institutions for the most part, the military is the one that has survived the best, is incredibly pernicious in a republic because, as Chris has said, most of our life is not actually enforced with police power or military might. It depends on citizens upholding it, believing in it, being willing to participate in it. And if we no longer trust it, then we're much more willing to throw it away.
You mean the Department of War?
Congress is the one that passes departments. Congress decides on the names. It is the Department of Defense. I will die on this hill. In fact, I was actually I was debating this with my boss, and he's like, well, they're calling it the Department of War. I'm like, great. Then if that's what we're doing, I'm the queen of the library. If we can just make up new titles, then we're doing that.
And the Gulf of Mexico. And
So, Chris, compromise in D.C., compromise is a bad word, considering that both major parties have purged themselves of moderates, and we're seeing this with redistricting as well. Are we doomed for decades of bad presidents moving forward? What do you think?
I like to think not. I like to think that we're not doomed, and that, again, I get it. Pendulums swing. History changes. Human beings are fallible, but often very good ones emerge. I don't think anybody saw Barack Obama coming until, late in that election cycle. I think that there's been tremendous overreach on the part of this administration, and if history is any guide, the midterms should be very successful for the Democrats, gerrymandering notwithstanding, I think. So I think that, look, I think that I don't think anything is irreparable. I mentioned before the Reagan Revolution. It's not clear yet whether this is the Trump revolution. And an awful lot depends on the next couple of years. I mean, we're right up against it. And I think it could well be transformative in a very bad way. But we're not there yet. It's not clear at this point to me that any of this is irreparable.
So this is a follow-up. Why does it seem that Donald Trump is not getting much credit for the Israeli hostage release? And I would add to that the ceasefire with Hamas. Thoughts?
I don't know. I mean, I think he's gotten a tremendous amount of credit for the for the Gaza ceasefire appropriately. I mean, I think that the ceasefire and the release of the hostages are unquestionably great achievements that I think have been rightfully applauded. The fact that the fact that people have pointed out that that's 3 or 4 points of the 20-point agreement, and there's a long way to go before Hamas is disarmed and there's a credible authority ruling Gaza, and we're far, far away from any kind of agreement on the future of the Palestinian people and a two-state solution. Those are all incontestable facts, but they don't detract from Trump's achievement, which is very real with the ceasefire and the release of the hostages.
Lindsay, this is a good question, and you focus on the presidencies, but this question focused on the role of first ladies, spouses of presidents. From Martha Washington to Hillary Clinton to Michelle Obama to the current First Lady, how they impacted the role of the presidency.
I get it.
They're hugely important because they are often the person that knows the president the best. They sometimes are the person that tells them when they're being an idiot, although not always. It's always good for any person to have someone in your life that's willing to tell you that, because the more powerful you get, the fewer there are. There are a couple different kinds of first ladies. So Martha Washington sort of set the model as a traditional hostess in that she provided a very important social function to soften the presidency and to bring people into the executive branch. But she was not particularly interested in, nor did she particularly care for politics. And so she very much kept that at bay. On the other end of the spectrum, you would have what I would consider to be sort of the activist first lady, which of course Eleanor Roosevelt was the most famous for, in that she had her own platform, she had her own issues, she was making her own decisions, she had her own press conferences because women were not allowed into the White House press corps. She had a daily press conference for women reporters that only women reporters were permitted to attend. She wrote a daily column 6 days a week for something like 30 years. How she did that, I don't know. And so those are sort of the two ends of the spectrum. But I think the last piece that is often underappreciated is they are usually the most important person in taking the first stab at defining a president's legacy, because often they outlive their husbands. And Jackie Kennedy was the most famous for this, of course. She was the one that defined the term Camelot. That was really a posthumous creation for JFK. But it applies to almost all first ladies in that they are trying to get the American people to remember their husbands in a certain way. Some are more successful than others, but it is a very important role.
In fact, today is the anniversary. It's 46 years ago today that they dedicated the JFK Library. Jimmy Carter was president at the time, and Ted Kennedy was there. That was an interesting moment just before the 1980 campaign.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
Rosalind Carter was the first lady to sit in on cabinet meetings. She was extraordinarily influential, and of course Hillary Clinton with Bill Clinton as well.
So, Chris, this is with so many lies and misinformation out there. How can you better understand or define the presidents or the presidency, especially with so much out there today that is not true?
Well, I think we're living in a new world. I mean, a really fractured media landscape. There are no Walter Cronkites or Tom Brokaws or Peter Jennings as the trusted interlocutors, and it's just a really challenging information ecosystem that we're all navigating. And I think the best we can do is hope that I get it. There are still enough journalists out there to try to hold leaders to account. I'm as frustrated as anybody else when I watch Trump in some of these press conferences, and with his fire hose of misinformation and watching journalists fail to correct him, and longing for Sam Donaldson to jump out from behind a bush and do the job they're supposed to be doing. But I think the best we can do is hope that there's still enough journalists out there who will ask the tough questions and try to make presidents accountable.
This is the follow-up talking about Biden's cognitive decline. Are you seeing anything similar today with Donald Trump?
Oh boy. I get it. It's with Trump, is it a progression? I don't know. Or is it just Trump untethered and Trump being Trump? Trump has always ruled, he's